Welcome, brothers. Cowboy here, and this is my review of Warhammer 40K Space Marine 2. But what is happening, y'all? I'm so excited to finally talk about this one. I remember this was originally slated back for like December 23, at least that's when it was rumored, and then obviously we did not get it then, but here we are, roughly 9 months later, and we have a beautifully delivered Warhammer baby that we're going to be talking about today. Big thanks to Focus Entertainment for a review code of the game. Now, I do want to say up front that this review is primarily, or I should say entirely, based on my experience in the campaign. I wanted to check out multiplayer, but I couldn't get any of the matches to work in early access. And then there are the optional multiplayer missions, which are basically like side stories that tie into the main campaign, but I wanted to wait and do those with friends, so this review is entirely just based on the main campaign of the game, which did take me about 8.5 hours to get through. Now, before you go, wait a minute, 8.5 hours, that's all there is in this game. No, once again, there are the optional missions. Just based on how long the various campaign missions take, I would guess each of those optionals is going to take roughly another hour. There's also all the multiplayer. And then obviously this isn't including any potential replayability that the game obviously has a bunch of with the various difficulties, loadouts, and the ability to do things co-op with friends. But with all that being said, let's jump in and talk about my experience with Space Marine 2. And the first thing I want to talk about is the gameplay, because we have a pretty beefy evolution from the first game. Now, the original Space Marine was something that I played during a little bit of a slow season. Fans recommended it, checked it out, absolutely loved it. Up until that point, my level of familiarity with 40K was extremely little. And so that kind of got me a little bit more into the lore, had me looking up stuff about the various characters, the factions and whatnot. There's a lot. It's very overwhelming if you're not somebody that's like followed 40K for a while to try and get into it, but it's definitely a worthwhile franchise to get involved with. But coming into Space Marine 2, this was something that I've been looking forward to for a while, and I definitely think it delivered on my expectations. We have a pretty nice gameplay evolution here where we're pulling in a lot of different things that have become more commonplace in gaming. You know, we have the attacks that have to be dodged or attacks that can be parried or dodged. We have the timing parries and then the counter follow-ups on attacks. We obviously have the run and gun that was very familiar from the first game, and melee combat in particular has actually been expanded a bit. We now have multiple different melee weapons that all have very distinct movesets, and all of it felt very, very good. It still had that same kind of arcade feel, I guess, that the first game had, but obviously it has been updated in a major way. Feels extremely good to play. And honestly, the biggest thought that was in my mind when I was playing it was just like, dude, this is just peak video gaming right here. You know, I remember growing up and games like this where you were blasting your way through hordes of enemies and slicing stuff up and there's blood everywhere and you're doing these brutal executions. Like, these were the kind of games that growing up you were like, oh my God, it's the coolest game ever. And this is like the epitome of that. It takes everything that makes video games awesome, like that power fantasy, and it just cranks it up and it lets you just completely embrace it. So big kudos to them because they did a fantastic job with the gameplay. Talking a little bit more about some of the changes in depth, one of the things that I found interesting, and I'm not sure if this is just me being paranoid, but I'm pretty sure they have the Doom style of health here, and what I mean by that is like the last quarter of your health bar is roughly double the amount of the rest of your health bar, because I would get into fights and dude, my health would be getting blown away and I would be hanging on for what seemed like forever by just a thread of health and regenning armor. And it always kept things very intense with me trying to survive. Now, one of the ways you get your armor back now is, especially with larger enemies and with smaller enemies, but anytime you get an execute, you're going to get a bar of armor back. So you have this gameplay loop where you're taking down enemies and then you're getting up so you can execute them, regen your armor, taking down enemies, getting up so you can execute them, regen your armor. And it's this constant loop where you don't want to sit back too far and shoot. And at the same time, you don't want to be completely buried in the fray because you're going to be, bleeding out, losing all your armor. So you have a very nice back and forth where you're taking out enemies with your melee, and then you're popping off enemies with your guns, and then you're getting back with the melee, and then back with the guns, and then into the execute. There's also a really fun counter system I like, where if you would parry the larger enemies, you would have a chance to instantly follow up with your pistol for a headshot, and that would either put them into an execute state, or in some cases you could do a double tap and just kill them out right there if you didn't need the armor. So that felt really good. The gunplay of the various guns were really nice. In particular, I ended up going towards the plasma weaponry a lot. And out of the new weapons, the power sword was definitely the one that I vibed with the most, having two very distinct movesets, one designed more around cleaving and one designed more around fast strikes and single target. But obviously, the power hammer as well as the chain sword are here as well. The dagger comes in this time as well. So a lot of more variety compared to the first game. And that's also something I saw out in the field as I was playing. As I was going through the game, and even before you go on a mission, you have an armory where you're going to be able to pick what primary you want, pick what secondary you want, and pick your melee. And as you progress through the various campaign missions, you're going to unlock more gear to choose from. But on top of that, let's say you pick something and it's not really working out, you're going to find a replacement in the mission. Outside of the pylons, which typically have 4 weapons you can choose from, and you'll find those scattered around main areas, you'll typically find weapons just kind of stashed away or lying on the ground, along with gratuitous amounts of ammo. So there's never really a point where you're like, oh my god, I'm struggling, I'm running out of bullets, or oh, this gun's terrible, how am I going to get through the game? That's not something I encountered, and to be honest, that's exactly how I want things to be. In a game like this, in a game like 40K, where you're playing an Ultramarine, you want to feel like a god on the battlefield, and I think they do a really good job at accomplishing that here. And talking a little bit more about that, because I do think that's a very tricky thing to get right with a game like this, especially if you're familiar with 40K whatsoever. When it comes to an Ultramarine, these guys are way, way beyond what humans are capable of. They're literally angels of death on the battlefield. They are massive, they are incredibly strong, they are fighting off hordes completely on their own. And so I definitely think it's a little bit of a tricky thing to balance that power fantasy where you feel overwhelmingly strong, but at the same time providing a good gameplay challenge. And I think they did a really solid job here. The game does a good split of overwhelming you with the weaker enemies while also mixing in some bigger and heavier elites that you're also going to have to contend with. And so it keeps you on your toes where you're trying to handle all the chafe while also paying attention to the bigger guys, while also making sure that you're keeping your armor up and making sure you're snagging up some ammo when you need it, or grabbing grenades or stims or whatever the case is. And even though there were plenty of times that I went down and had to go back to a checkpoint, there was never a time where I felt weak or underpowered. And I think that's very important in a game like this where you're trying to convey a power fantasy. Talking a little bit about difficulty, there are 4 difficulty selections, basically easy, normal, hard, and extreme. I believe there's actually a 5th one called lethal that's planned for after launch. I just ended up playing the game on hard because it said that was the intended playthrough experience, and I thought it was pretty good. There were more than a few times where I had to restart at a checkpoint, but thankfully the game does an excellent job of providing those checkpoints roughly before every major battle. Which is also good because I did have one crash. I'm just going to get bugs out of the way. I only had one bug. It was one crash in the entirety of the game. And the nice thing was the game crashed. I loaded back in and I had lost maybe 10 seconds of progress because of how frequent those checkpoints are. So those checkpoints, alongside how kind of just visceral and intense the combat can get, I think it's pretty nice because you are feeling at risk a lot of the time. But at the same time, if you go down, you're not really losing too much progress, which is something I appreciate in a game when it respects your time like that. Moving on from gameplay, though, let's talk about world design, because even as someone that is newer to 40K as a franchise, I absolutely loved the world design in this game. The transitions when you're on the battle barge, the small details when you're down on the planets, and in particular, there was a lot of contextual lore and kind of background lore that was happening that I really appreciated. And there's 2 examples of this that I really want to call out. There was one instance where it was another space marine we met up with. He ends up dying on a mission. He's not like a main side character. He's just this dude you meet. So I'm not really considering this much of a spoiler. But then when we get back to the battle barge, there's already a memorial set up for this guy. And there's other space marines talking about the various things he did and the times that he may have saved their lives or he was on the lines with them. And that was a really cool attention to detail. And then at one point I find a databank talking about soldiers that are deserting. And then sure enough, fast forward a little bit, and there's a straight up firing squad taking deserters out. And I'm like, yo, this is absolutely wild. Like, to see that happen and see, that level of world building and that going down, that's something that really immerses you in this setting and really just kind of shows, just how grim dark this world is. So that's something that I thought was really cool and I think enhances the experience. In terms of the worlds themselves and exploring them, I think they're pretty straightforward. Most of the times you're gonna go along some pretty linear path, I should say. It's linear. There's a couple little side paths here and there where you might find a data bank, but for the most part, it's linear. You're gonna find little areas where you need to move the stone or jump over the stone to proceed. So don't go into this expecting an open world experience, but I don't think that's really what anyone had as an anticipation with Space Marine. But I do think it's something that I should kind of set the ground rule for. Talking a little bit about the story, obviously no spoilers, but I will say I thoroughly enjoyed the story here, especially coming off of the experience of Space Marine 1, which I think had a little bit of a sour ending there with Titus getting taken away by the Inquisition. They did a great job of weaving that into the story here and addressing it, and it actually serves as a bit of a central plot point for quite a bit of the story, and in a really interesting way that I think helps pull the story in the sequel together quite well. On top of that, there's just some really nice interactions that are going on, and we get to learn a little bit more about the various relationships Titus has with some of these people, including superior commanders and stuff like that. So all in all, I think they did an excellent job with the story here. One of the things I appreciated is the ending is also wrapped up very nicely, but still leaves things open for future content, which is great because they've obviously mentioned there are more things to come. So I think they did a great job there. Story has a mix of Tyranid as well as Chaos Marines, so that was really nice because especially, the first game, it was orcs, and to be honest, after a while, you're like, all right, I've killed enough orcs. Can we mix things up? So it was nice to see two of the enemy factions making an appearance in different ways. I thought that was also really fun. But all in all, I had a blast with the story. I'm not expecting Oscar-worthy writing, but I thought the story was fun. I felt like I was just having a hell of a time. And yeah, I enjoyed it. Talking about graphics, I also think they did really nice on the graphics here, in particular when it comes to armor detail, like the color schemes, the embellishments, the areas where it's scratched and dented. Everything has this very gritty look, but just really pops out. And everything I've seen of 40K, I think they did an excellent job representing it in this game. I know I am not the arbiter of 40K, but from what I know of the franchise, I think they absolutely nailed it here. One of the bigger things when it comes to graphics is just kind of the fidelity down in the fray. And that's something that I wasn't too sure about because they obviously went for a swarm engine very similar to what World War Z uses. And, every now and again with stuff like that, there's just so much going on screen that a lot of it kind of turns into slop. And I think they did a pretty good job here. Everything still manages to stay pretty distinct. The executions are just filled full of blood, like literally blood explosions happening. And everything still manages to kind of maintain its image and look good. The graphical fidelity felt really high. I was playing this on PC with a 4090, 4K, DLSS was on. Every single setting was cranked up to ultra. And on average, I was sitting around 85 to 80 FPS. So I'd say that's pretty solid because usually these days you either have very poor DLS implementation and you're barely struggling to stay above 60, or you're not getting above 60. So seeing everything cranked up and the game still running beautifully smooth while also simultaneously trying to record 4K 60 on the same machine, that's a seal of approval for me as far as graphics and performance goes. When it comes to audio in particular, I do think the music was a little bit lacking at times. There weren't all that many epic scores going off during boss fights. Audio design itself, though, was top-notch. The sound of your armored footsteps hitting the ground, the sound of the flesh skeleton welching, and the bullets, and all the fire, and all the effects going off, all of that was incredibly well done. The sound of the chainsaw cutting through enemies. But I wish we had some epic battle tracks going on in the background, and I do think that's something that just kind of felt oddly missing. You had a couple of the overture tones, they're dun 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 dun, but there wasn't all that many, and it was something that kind of left me wondering as I was playing, man, where's my battle music? But at the same time, there's just so much going on in combat with the sound that I guess you could even say the music is just the sound of combat. But it is something that I felt was missing and something that I think they probably could have given a little bit more attention to. Moving on from there, in terms of length and price. So as I mentioned, the campaign itself took me 8.5 hours. There are also the 6 side story missions, and these are basically side stories that take place alongside the campaign that a separate contingent of Space Marines are doing while you're doing the main campaign stuff. So you can go through those solo. You can also go through those co-op. I haven't done those. I would guess they're going to add roughly 6 more hours of playtime. And then there's also the multiplayer. So on average, I would say most players are going to be looking at minimum 20 hours to experience all the PvE content and at least dabble in the PvP content. Now, obviously, there is a lot more you could potentially do trying out, higher difficulties, better mission times, stuff like that. But all in all, 20 hours, getting that out of a game, I'm happy with that. I would consider that worthwhile. As for the price of it, the base game comes in at $60, and then there are 2 other editions, one of them which includes the Season Pass, and then a higher one which includes the Season Pass, and then a secondary set of various Ultramarine skins that you can use in the multiplayer mode. And so, entirely cosmetic type stuff or Season Pass stuff if you're interested in stuff like that. But outside of that, as of now, there have been reported no microtransactions that are going to be added to the game. And I do think that is something worth mentioning, especially when it comes to customization. And just to kind of show some customization footage, this actually reminded me immediately of Armored Core 6. Where you're sitting there and you have all these various colors for your mech and you can change out decals and all sorts of stuff. It's very much like that. Now, a lot of the stuff you are going to have to unlock, and as you play and you do either cooperative missions with friends or you do the player versus player missions, you're going to earn a currency that you can then use to unlock various color schemes and various emblems of the different Space Marine or the Chaos Marine chapters to decorate your armor with whatever colors or decorations that you want. But you do have to earn this stuff. And it reminds me of the older days of gaming, where it wasn't pay money to unlock the skin. It was, oh, you want that skin that looks like a super badass? Yeah, play. Earn that. Some of the cooler skins were like win 30 matches using this character. And that's something that we don't see anymore these days. And it was really cool to see that come back. I remember playing Heroes of the Storm and I had my master skin, and then Blizzard was like, actually, you can just buy these now. And it felt like, what the hell? I earned this. I wore this because it looked badass and I earned it. And now Jimmy down the street just gets to spend $10 and he has the same master skin. And so it's really cool to see a game that brings back that sense of prestige where your character gets to look like an absolute badass because you played through those matches and you put in that time to earn that badass visual appeal that you're going for. So all in all, what would I rate this at? This is an easy 5 out of 5 for me. I'm not even the biggest 40K fan. If you're a 40K fan, this is probably going to be your game of the year. They did a phenomenal job here. The game plays great. The customization is awesome. When you're looking at the various armors, there's even little lore entries that give you some details about those various Space Marine chapters, which especially as someone that's more new to the franchise, that was something I was very appreciative of. But I mean, this is just a proper video game, Like I said back at the start, when I the type of games that I loved playing growing up, this is like the peak evolution of that. It's just filled with action. There's tons of blood explosions. There's tons of customization. You're earning all your rewards, and it just feels good to play. This is the type of game that's just pure, unadulterated fun. And, I don't think we get enough of those these days. I feel that so many games are trying to do something, that are trying to, evolve the medium or do something new, that some of them go a little bit too far and they just forget what makes games fun. And sometimes what makes games fun is just me taking a chainsaw sword and slicing through hordes of enemies and then parrying a Tyranid and then ripping the shell off of his face and then punching his skull down into his stomach. That's all you need for a game to be fun. So either way, easy 5 out of 5 for me on this one. I had an absolute blast. I already have the Let's Play done. It clocks in at 19 episodes. I'm going to be streaming the co-op missions with a buddy. I also plan on doing a bunch of multiplayer, assuming it works at launch. But yeah, I mean, I had a blast with this, and honestly, I just can't wait to play more. So hell yeah, man, for the Emperor.